Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for braving the sheeting rain outside. I always fear when it rains that people are going to stay at home and not come out, but congratulations to you all for making it out this afternoon. My name's Tom Keatinge. I'm the Director of the Finance and Security Programme here at RUSI. And as I say, you're all very welcome. The topic of sanctions has been a thread through our work over the last 10 years, but of course in the last 2.5 years, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has obviously required us and many other people to ramp up focus and engagement with that topic. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Stephanie Baker here this afternoon to talk about her new book, Punishing Putin. I was just telling someone I've had 17 hours of British Airways inflicted delays in the last month. So I was glad to have, by the way, it doesn't take 17 hours to read Stephanie's book, but I was glad to have Stephanie's book with me. And we're going to basically take a bit of a kind of a journey through it. One thing I just want to draw your attention to, hopefully you can see the Slido code there. If you want to ask questions, do please submit them through Slido. If we have time for in-person questions, we'll do that. But if you've got a burning question you want to ask, please submit it via Slido. And then after the event finishes, which will be an hour or so, we'll be serving drinks upstairs if you want to hang around and can't face the rain. But more importantly, the indefatigable bookseller is up there, and so I would encourage you, please, to take advantage of that to get hold of a copy of the book and indeed a copy of Stephanie's autograph. So with that, thank you all for coming, and we will begin proceedings. So I wanted to start, Stephanie, by asking you to kind of introduce yourself, because a lot of people who've engaged with the sanctions topic over the last 2.5 years are kind of Johnny-come-latelys to Russia and all the rest of it. And in a polite way, you're not. So maybe you could begin by just giving us a bit of an insight into your experience of Russia and indeed understanding the Russian economy.
Right. So I was a young reporter in Moscow in the 1990s, where I really wanted to become a political journalist, but the big story was the economic transformation. So I began covering the economy, privatization, and the wave of Western companies moving into Russia. So when I set about to write this book, I realized it was important to understand what happened in the 1990s if you really want to understand the economic battle playing out today, both in terms of the so-called oligarchs that were being targeted, as well as the rise of Putin, and kind of how we got here, what went wrong. And so I sort of went back and dug in my attic for all my old clips, and because I'm such a pack rat, I saved everything. And looking back on that period, obviously I knew it at the time, but I was very young and not that experienced. But the economic trauma that happened, I mean, you were there during that period too, but I traveled around the country, coal miners, textile workers who hadn't been paid for months and months, and they continued working. So I think it was really important to kind of understand that period, and in particular, how there was this false understanding, I think, that in the 90s, as long as Russia transitioned to a market economy, democracy would just soon follow. And there wasn't enough attention paid to the kind of building of democratic institutions or the checks and balances that were needed, obviously the rampant corruption that was happening at the time, and the infamous loans for shares program, whereby certain oligarchs got Russia's crown jewels in oil and metals in exchange for loans to the government. That was in many ways what many people have called Russia's original sin, that established the basis for the kind of corrupt crony capitalism that we see today, that led to Putin's rise, as well as his enrichment of a new crop of oligarchs, which I go into in the book as well. So I went back to Russia periodically. As I was joking with a friend of mine, you can leave Russia, but Russia never leaves you. So I did go back periodically, and in particular start reporting on the sanctions in a more intense way from 2018, when the US rolled out a bunch of sanctions against top oligarchs.
Yes, I guess I was pulling in the other direction at that time, desperately trying to get the Russian banks to embrace capitalism, which of course they did very effectively, but the rest of the Russian economy did not follow that. So you mentioned 2018. Obviously, there was the initial spate of sanctions following 2014. I guess a direct question from the work that you did for the book and the reporting. I mean, how prepared do you think the G7 community was for the implementation of sanctions in 2022, in light of lessons learned in the previous 8 years and so on? I mean, were they as ready as James cleverly told me they were on Twitter when I challenged him on the question?
It's a good question. Obviously, they saw the intelligence about Russian troops building up on the border, and there was some deep thinking, particularly about how vulnerable Western economies were to Russia's energy, and that would be a crucial crunch point if Russia did in fact invade and they had to respond economically. But on another level, clearly they were not. They were not prepared for the scale of the invasion as it panned out. I think perhaps they were prepared for maybe a smaller scale invasion of a sort of Russian forces pushing out from the Donbass, not for tanks rolling towards Kiev. And so there was a lot of scrambling done in those first few days. And I go into that in the book, the decision that they took within 2 days of the invasion to do what had been previously not seriously contemplated before, which was the immobilization of Russia's central bank reserves. A massive pot of money, roughly 300 billion, parked in Western financial institutions. And I go into the book how they were getting reports from French intelligence that Russia was already moving the money out. So they had to move incredibly quickly. And but if you look at the sanctions that were rolled out, just even that first month, there was still a lot of division over how far to go on financial sanctions, how many banks to kick out of SWIFT, this Gmail for the financial world to facilitate payments. And even within the first few days, it took them a while to put full blocking sanctions on Russia's state-controlled Sberbank, its biggest bank, because there was division, particularly in Europe. European countries were worried about how they would pay for gas supplies in particular. And that actually has persisted. There's huge carve-outs for certain banks in order to facilitate payments for Russian natural gas. So I think they could have been far more prepared. And I think the UK in particular was caught unprepared, both in terms of just staffing and resources. I mean, that's true, I think, across the US and Europe. But they didn't have a ready-made arsenal of economic tools ready to go.
Well, we'll come back to the UK, one of my favourite topics, later on. But I can't remember whether this is my shorthand in my notes or whether you actually use this phrase in the book. But I think you sort of suggested that some key US government people that you spoke to felt that they were kind of pushing a boulder uphill in trying to build a kind of coalition around sanctions activity. So if that was right, was it not therefore until the actual invasion happened that people thought, crikey, this is a real thing? Or I mean, what galvanized people to embrace sanctions in an unprecedented way?
Yeah, that was actually Bjorn Seibert, who's von der Leyen's head of cabinet. But I think other US officials gave me the same metaphor. I think the thing that really turned things around was Bucha. I think the images of the atrocities in Bucha shocked so many. To see those kind of war crimes images in Europe in 2022, I think forced many European leaders into thinking the unthinkable. And it was soon after that they proposed an embargo on Russian oil. Initially in the first month or two, energy was untouchable because of dependence, particularly in countries like Germany. But then I think after Bucha, there was just such outrage that was harder to control. And I go into it in the book about how the Biden administration was like, wait a minute, a EU embargo on Russian oil, including Western shipping services, insurance, that could cause prices to spike and potentially a global recession. So that had them scrambling to come up with an alternative solution, which we can go into in a little bit.
And that, if I remember rightly, was that at the point where they were worried about the midterm elections and driving season or whatever it's called in the US and all of that?
Yeah, I mean that.
So no thought for the Ukrainians, just a thought for the cost of gas in the United States.
I think in fairness, they needed to be able to build political support for this. So already, in many ways, Putin invaded at the worst possible time because economies were coming out of the pandemic, there were supply chain issues that was causing inflation. So anything that would have added to inflation on top of that was considered unthinkable, particularly before the midterms, it's true. Now, it's hard to tell what would have happened had the embargo gone ahead without any of the additional solutions that they came up with. They came up with this price cap on Russian oil, barring Western services, insurance and the like for oil traded above $60 a barrel. And, if that had not been imposed, it's unclear how, and the EU embargo went ahead just as it stood, what would have happened. I think you would have seen a spike in inflation. And I think that goes back to one of the central arguments or strategies of sanctions, is that you want to hit your target harder than you hit your own economy. And that has been, I think, one of the central challenges of this whole economic war from the get-go. Because Russia was such a major oil exporter, they were limited as to how far they could go without causing pain at home. And I think that remains the central challenge until they can figure out how to cap and really drive down Putin's oil revenues. It's going to be really hard to undermine his ability to sustain the war.
But that comes to, I guess, an important point where if we go back to before February 2022, I suppose the question is we talked already a little bit about how well prepared were the EU and the G7 community. But whereas one gets the sense that kind of Russia was preparing, trying to isolate itself to the extent it could against some impacts of sanctions, what lessons had the G7 community learned from the weak application of sanctions after 2014? And then the big question is, should there have been more suspended sentence on sanctions to try and deter Putin from evading? Did anyone express to you a view as to whether sanctions should have been used differently in order to deter invasion rather than wait until it happened and then use sanctions to punish Putin?
Yeah, I asked Boris Johnson this very question, and he said, there was a debate amongst G7 leaders about whether or not, how much to show their hand, so to speak, to try to dissuade Putin from invading. And he told me that Olaf Scholz in particular was arguing for what he called strategic ambiguity, that was better to just threaten massive economic consequences without spelling out what they would do, which in fairness may if you spell out exactly what you're going to do, if they said we're going to freeze Russia's central bank reserves, he would have been moving that money out as soon as possible. So on one level, I'm not sure sanctions would have been a good deterrent. They clearly didn't work as a deterrent. I think Putin was intent on invading Ukraine regardless, and I think that's another theme that has come out, which is that Putin doesn't really care about the economy. He doesn't care about the economic costs. So it's very hard. I mean, yes, there are building costs. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been taken out of the Russian economy, either through capital flight or the costs that they've had to bear for building their shadow fleet of oil tankers or what have you. But does he care about the long-term health of the Russian economy? I don't think so. I think he cares about his inner circle and how he's able to sustain his power.
So let's talk about the first 2, 3, 4 months of the sanctions campaign after February 2022. It seemed to us here that, if you like, the easy levers were the first levers that were pulled. So sanctioning oligarchs, we'll come on to oligarchs in a second and avoid slap suits, but sanctioning oligarchs, freezing banks and so on. So maybe can you take us kind of inside the thinking that was going on at that point? Was it simply we've got to throw out sanctions as quickly as possible, we know how to do financial sanctions, so we'll go after oligarchs and we'll go after banks? Or what was the philosophy, I suppose, in the early days?
Right, so initially it was the financial sanctions that they started with and the banks, and it took time to gain consensus between Europe and the US and the UK on which banks to kick out of SWIFT. And those were seen as potentially the most impactful. Remember also that the US announced sweeping export controls on Russia the day of the invasion, and then others followed soon, and that coalition quickly grew to almost 40 countries. And I think that was probably under-recognized as a important step. It's been a very difficult front in the economic war to wage, but I think that was denying Russia access to Western technology has been a very important part of the economic war. And I think combined with the financial sanctions are proving to be the two most important levers that we have against Russia.
So you've mentioned SWIFT 2 or 3 times here. Did anyone understand what SWIFT was when they were marching in the streets saying de-SWIFT Russia, or they were standing up in Congress saying de-SWIFT Russia? You describe it as, I think, the Gmail account or something like that of the global banking system. Did anyone understand what on earth they were talking about?
I don't think so. And I think it just become this rallying cry for people as a way of punishing Putin. So there were these people with placards outside the White House in the first few days of the invasion saying, kick Russia off SWIFT. It had been described as so that people could understand what it was, the Gmail of banking, a messaging platform so that banks could communicate with each other as they transmitted payments. But I think we now do know a lot. I mean, I think more people do now finally know what SWIFT is. We can get into this, but Russia was able to withstand some of those financial sanctions because it had been building up defenses for years. Since 2014, it had developed its own version of SWIFT, SPFS, and its own version of alternative to Visa and MasterCard, MIR, so that when that happened, when Visa and MasterCard got out of Russia and when Russian banks were banned from SWIFT, actually internal payments in Russia were still functioning, whereas they might not have been had they not done that.
So, but for me, SWIFT in a way is a microcosm of the somewhat kind of half-hearted way in which this was approached, because, of course, not all banks were kicked out of SWIFT. Yeah. Certain banks had to be left in SWIFT in order to continue to receive energy payments. Certain banks could act as fronts for other banks operating in SWIFT. So, again, maybe you can take us inside some of the kind of some of the trade-off discussions that were going on, not necessarily specifically about SWIFT, but just generally across the Atlantic, because there were different equities involved in sanctioning Russia.
No, in particular, I think Europe and Germany in particular were pushing to keep certain banks in SWIFT so that they could continue paying for Russian gas. And the big one is, of course, Gazprom Bank, which has been the biggest bank facilitating a lot of these trades. I mean, I think there are at least maybe a dozen banks that are still allowed to operate, Russian banks that are still allowed to operate on SWIFT. So that was a very conscious decision to limit the costs of the economic war in Europe. And I think there's still calls that they should be kicking out Gazprom Bank, that actually Europe has now weaned itself off of Russian gas. I mean, it's gone down something, the latest figures are something like 9-10%. So is there room to kick out more banks and to impose further restrictions? I think there probably are. But I go into this in the book that one of the crucial things when Zelensky was in Kiev and the Russian troops were heading towards the capital, he tells Boris Johnson this kind of, he acts like the actor he is and says to Boris, to SWIFT or not to SWIFT. I mean, that was one of the central demands that Zelensky was...
Sure he said that? That sounds like something that Boris might have sort of extemporized, shall we say.
No, I think he knew this would land well with Boris Johnson, and he was very much delivering a message that he knew, would have open ears.
But so, not to dwell on SWIFT too much, but is this not potentially a kind of an issue that we've faced? Is that expectation management on the impact of sanctions has perhaps got way ahead of itself. So in other words, everyone's marching in the streets saying, de-SWIFT Russia. Russia gets somewhat de-SWIFTed. What happens? So I suppose, have we allowed the expectations on sanctions to kind of get ahead of what they can genuinely achieve?
I think they definitely did, particularly in those early couple of months, and when the Russian economy really did swoon in March in the wake of the freezing of the central bank assets, the ruble dropped, and the issue is Putin has a very competent, technically competent central banker in his corner who has really helped him steady the ship. She imposed massive capital controls, hiked interest rates to kind of steady the economy, and that worked. And you look at other countries under sanctions that didn't have that, Venezuela being one of them, and you see what happens, how the sanctions can play out very differently. I mean, she, in many respects, is one of the crucial figures that has helped fight the economic war and prop up Putin.
So we're going to talk about oligarchs, because certainly in this town, there's obviously been a long history of calls from civil society and others that oligarchs should be sanctioned, or oligarchs should face the full force of the National Crime Agency. The oligarchs were the big focus in the first days of the full-scale invasion. So why was that? What was the logic behind putting the various oligarch names up in lights? And indeed, I've got some screenshots of the FCDO website from the Truss era where it was like sort of wanted posters, Deripaska, boom, sanctioned, Vexelberg, boom, sanctioned. What was the point of all that?
Well, on one level, the UK had a lot of catching up to do because it hadn't sanctioned a lot of these guys. They were sanctioned, some of them were sanctioned in the US and not sanctioned here, so they were allowed to operate freely in London, even though they were barred from the US. It's called London grad for a reason. So much Russian money had been coursing through banks and facilitated by lawyers and accountants that I think it was easy pickings, really, with visible assets to go after, and what was undoubtedly a populist push, capitalizing off of the public outrage over what was happening in Ukraine. I don't think there was necessarily a lot of thinking about what that would do on the ground in Russia, but that they needed to draw a line. And one of the reasons why I wrote this book is I do see it as an end of an era. This is the end of London grad. I'm not saying that all Russian money is out of London. There's certainly some sanctioned Russian money that's, is behind some property, but the UK has frozen something like 22 billion pounds worth of assets. I'm sure there's more, but I think it was more an attempt to sort of say, this, we're not going to allow Russian money to influence the UK anymore. No more red carpet.
So you, in the book, you kind of contrast what the US has been doing as relates to kind of oligarchs and others, so the kind of klepto-capture task force and these things. But you also wrote about something which I'm ashamed to say I had never heard of before, which is Operation Accordable. So can you explain that? Because I certainly hadn't heard of that before.
Yeah, that it was new. That hadn't been reported before. So in 2018, after the U.S. sanctioned 7 oligarchs, they began monitoring their assets, mostly in the U.S., but they teamed up with the UK, with the NCA, for this Operation Accordable to monitor sanctioned oligarch assets. And the Southern District of New York, the U.S. attorney there, they were very aggressively pursuing some of these cases behind the scenes. We did not know what was happening. There were various raids, for instance, on Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska. He had several properties in the U.S., a mansion in D.C. and houses in New York City. And they were I think the U.S. Justice Department, the prosecutors there were quite frustrated. They weren't getting the level of cooperation they were hoping to from the UK. And that was in part because they had not sanctioned people like Oleg Deripaska, so they didn't see the grounds to go after him in the same way that the U.S. had. So I think that was a frustration that persisted for a number of years, certainly up to the invasion in 2022, but even after the invasion, when the Justice Department was trying to be really aggressive at tackling evasion and shutting down middlemen who were trading oil or, shipping semiconductors to Russia, they weren't getting the level of cooperation from European countries, in part because of the difference in legal systems, but there was more appetite than before the invasion, but it was still a bit of an uphill struggle.
Yeah, I think you noted at one point in the book, I'm not sure if this is your observation or whether someone said this to you, but while the US hassled Deripaska over visas, the UK welcomed him, which I suppose sums up the issue that was faced. The other thing that you talk about in relation to the oligarchs, it's something that I think interests a lot of us in the kind of research world in London, is this tactic of going after the enablers. So you tell the story of Graham Bonham Carter, for example. So maybe you could just elaborate on that and perhaps why that strategy was pursued.
Yeah, so the U.S. Justice Department set up this klepto-capture task force to go after sanctioned assets. And obviously with a lot of the Russian billionaires in Russia or Turkey or Dubai, they were out of reach. But the people that worked for them, the so-called enablers, fixers, people who were arranging their, taking care of their luxury property or art collections, those people were in jurisdictions where the U.S. might be able to get to them. So as a way of showing that the sanctions had real teeth, they went after these enablers. And of course, that's been a huge problem for the UK for years. London has been host to all sorts of enablers for the Russian billionaire class, willing to do, various things, and they were able to crack the code of several of these enablers. One in the UK, Graham Bonham Carter, and a few others in the US. I think it was a strategy not designed. I think it was a demonstration of the power of sanctions, and it was meant to scare other so-called enablers from continuing to do that business, to shut down networks that Russian billionaires were using to move money around the world. I think that was quite effective, and I'm sure there are more enablers that are in their sights.
Well, there's another one I think that you refer to in the book, Robert Wise, connected with Vexelberg, right? So that's another example of a similar enabler situation.
Right, and that's still ongoing. I mean, in some cases, you look at the legal filings and it all goes quiet. And you can only conclude that there are certain talks going on. It's always hard to tell, but yes. And, they have been very aggressive. And I do think that does send a signal that it's not worth the risk.
We can't end the discussion about oligarchs without getting on the district line here and travelling towards Fulham and visiting Chelsea FC. What on earth has happened there? Why are we still discussing what happens to the sale proceeds of Chelsea Football Club?
It's a really important question, and I can't believe it still hasn't been resolved at this point. The sanctions against Roman Abramovich forced him to sell Chelsea. He, at the beginning of the sale process, promised to put all the proceeds into a foundation to benefit the victims of the war in Ukraine. It was quite a fuzzy definition of who are the victims of the war in Ukraine. When he sold the club, efforts were made to set up a foundation. Experienced NGO people were appointed, but they could not get an agreement with the UK government on the terms of using that money, the roughly 2.5 billion pounds, and that still remains up in the air today. If you talk to UK officials, they want assurances that it will only be spent inside Ukraine. The people that were appointed to run the foundation want more flexibility to be able to use that money for, say, Ukrainian refugees in Europe, people in the global south who might be suffering from higher food prices, what have you. I think there's probably a lot more going on behind the scenes, and I need to be careful about what I say, but it's a travesty that there's this huge pot of money that could be going to Ukraine and is not. There's blame traded on each side. Abramovich says he's not standing in the way of the money being used, but there's something happening in between as they can't get an agreement. And the foundation hasn't formally yet applied for permission to be set up because they don't think the UK government will grant it to them.
But did something go wrong in the kind of the drafting of the agreement? Because obviously Chelsea Football Club required a license was required to sell it and so on. So at some point, there obviously was some error, or the drafting was not what it should have been in order to ensure that the ultimate outcome was successful. Or is it not that simple?
I don't think there was enough interrogation of the term victims of the war in Ukraine. And even at the time, there were people saying, well, that could mean Russians as well. And I think in the rush to sell the club and in the rush to push out more sanctions, there should have been more attention paid to the terms of setting up that foundation to head off this crisis. Even David Cameron was intent on trying to find a solution, and he couldn't fix it. So whether or not the new government can find a solution is unclear.
So like England's track record in taking penalties, the government fluffed it. There's a question here, and don't forget Slido's here if you want to ask a question. There's a question here that I'm going to ask you, which I think is a myth that we need to put to bed, but I'm going to ask you to put it to bed. Wasn't the rationale of going after the oligarchs to hurt Putin's inner circle, i.e. the people who depend on, people he depends on, to keep him in power, and so have influence on him? Could the oligarchs really influence Putin?
Right. So I think initially in 2014, there was this belief that if they sanctioned some of his closest confidants, that he would at least care what happened to them, and that might influence his calculus, but that did not pan out. So I do think it's pretty clear now that the way Putin runs Russia is that very few people have influence on him. On the contrary, everyone remains in fear of having their assets taken away and seized by the government, by the Kremlin. And I think it's a myth to think that those around him can walk in and be like, this is not going well.
They got him round the table. He got them round the table at the beginning of the full-scale invasion to basically implicate them in his decision-making.
Exactly.
So just maybe one last question on oligarchs. Of course, the theory is that sanctions go on and then something happens and sanctions come off. So where have we got to in the oligarch off-ramp discussion? Because as you rightly point out in the book, in June 2023, the FCDO flew this kite about donating of assets and blah, 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 blah. When I last checked, the pot is empty.
Yeah, I don't know why they announced that, because I don't think it was in any way realistic. They announced that sanctioned Russians could take their frozen assets and get them unfrozen to donate them to Ukraine, but there was no sanctions relief in exchange for that, and they were very clear that they did not want to have a quid pro quo. But if there's no motivation for doing that, it was a rather pointless strategy. I don't think. I'm not even sure they thought that they were going to raise any money from it, but it has not raised a penny.
But do you think that's because they all wanted to have a kind of tilt at the legal system first and see if they could challenge the sanctions in court? That's obviously much cheaper than donating 50% of your wealth.
Well, look, if you're a Russian billionaire and your assets are frozen in the West and the only access you have to cash is in Russia, if you're seen to be donating money to Ukraine, you'll probably be thrown in jail. I mean, you have Russians in Russia who've donated as little as $10 to a Ukrainian charity being thrown in prison for years. So just on that level alone, it showed a lack of understanding of the way Russia works. Now, could the sanctions have been rolled out in a more sophisticated way to split the elite, maybe even kill the oligarchy with the sanctions? I think they could have, but I don't think the US, Europe, or the UK had the resources or the intelligence, the sources of information to know who was who, to be able to do that. I do think that the Navalny Anti-Corruption Foundation laid it all out for them in great detail. And I think it's a shame that they did not follow what they had laid out. I mean, they could have obviously done their own due diligence on those names. They didn't need to swallow that full. But they had done all the research on the figures that they believed were very important to sanction, and that didn't happen. And they'd done that even before the invasion. The Navalny 35, the 35 most important Russian politicians and tycoons that should be sanctioned, and still to this day, not all of them are sanctioned everywhere.
So I want to turn to the question of procurement and microchips and all that sort of stuff. But one of the nice things about the book is, again, you provided a bit of history to that, because you took us back to kind of the COCOM era and so on. So maybe you could just spend a moment reminding people of that era, and then perhaps is there anything we should have learned from that period?
From COCOM.
COCOM, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I dug into this a little bit because I do think in terms of things like export controls, these trade restrictions on Russia, we are back to Cold War footing. There was a body called COCOM of Western allies coordinating trade restrictions on the Soviet Union, denying certain Western technology, and they've basically almost recreated it. I mean, it's different, obviously. It works in a different way, and it's the current regime, the current system that's in operation still needs some changes. But they really put the US, Europe, and the UK on a Cold War footing when it comes to technology. They're imposing the same kind of constraints, but obviously we're in a very different era. We're in technology is far more important, and we're operating with global supply chains that are much harder to control. So even though these 38 countries have come together to try to deny Russia access to key microelectronics, I think it's proven very hard to enforce, particularly without countries like China on board.
So, I mean, I suppose there are two elements to that. One is, as you say, there are the circumvention countries, so China et al. But then there are also those operating within our borders who are continuing to try and support Russia through procurement. And so there are a couple of examples you give in the book. The first one is the Lifshitz story. So maybe you could just kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Okay, so there were so many, the Justice Department went after various middlemen who were supplying Russia with technology, and it was hard to choose which one was the most interesting to dig into, but there's one case involving an FSB agent, intelligence officer, based in Estonia, who was working with one Ukrainian-Russian guy based in New Hampshire and another one in New Jersey. It was coordinated by a guy called Boris Lifshitz living in Russia. He was kind of directing this whole operation. So I just found it fascinating that these two guys in the United States who were facilitating the flow of technology, and one of them was in direct contact with an FSB officer. Now, this was particularly interesting because this officer was subsequently extradited to the US, and then he was one of the people that was swapped as part of the Evan Gershkovich massive swap. So there was some question initially, like how high up is he in the FSB? Well, he was important enough to be one of the key figures that Putin wanted back, to be returned back. That case is still ongoing, so I should be careful about what I say, but there are countless indictments of so-called middlemen for trading in this technology, some of whom, there was one guy in particular who was extradited from Hong Kong, very unusually, a guy called Maxim Marchenko. And so they've taken shots where they can, but I think going after middlemen is just a cat and mouse game that is never ending. And I think it's going to be very hard to shut that down without forcing the US semiconductor companies, and they're mostly US, some European, to really vet their supply chains to make sure that the stuff isn't getting to Russia. And I think they can do that because I've spent a lot of time going through Russian customs data. It's all there for the taking. And I'm not a sophisticated technology company. Like if I can see it, I'm sure that they can trace it as well.
But this, I guess, brings us like to another transatlantic division, because you use that story and then also the story about Us and Orekov to essentially, if you like, show the different approaches that there are in the US and Europe. So I think it's the Us and Orekov story. Sounds like a Keystone Cop story, right? The guy gets away.
The guy gets away. It's out of a bad Hollywood movie. Yeah, I mean, the U.S. indicted these two men, one Russian living in Italy, the other one in Germany, in Hamburg, and they were working together. They were trading Venezuelan oil, according to the U.S. indictment, and they were also shipping technology to Russia. On a U.S. request, the Germans arrested Orekov and Us. Us was put under house arrest rather than in a prison. He had an ankle bracelet, and a Bosnian Serbian gang basically sprang him out as soon as the extradition, his extradition was approved to the U.S. And he was spirited out by this gang to Serbia and then Russia. At the same time, the Germans didn't see a case against Orekov and let him go. And so you have these US prosecutors just apoplectic at this. They'd spent so much time trying to track these guys down, only for their counterparts in Europe to drop the ball. So I think it also goes at the limitations of this cat and mouse game. Unless you've got full cooperation from counterparties, it's not going to really go that far. And they don't have cooperation in places like Hong Kong where they really need it, where a lot of this trade is going through.
So from the work that you've been doing for the book, but just more broadly your reporting, are we seeing evidence that these kind of export controls, or these heightened export controls and sanctions on trade activity are actually working? So are we seeing an impact on the supply chain of the Russian military?
Right, so on one level, they are working because there's evidence that Russia is being forced to pay more for components that it needs, because everyone knows that it's a captive audience. So it's costing Russia more, but you do see huge millions of chips flowing into Russia without any constraints. Now, recently, the US threatened to impose sanctions on foreign financial institutions that were doing business with the Russian military-industrial complex. They made that first threat in December, and then they widened the definition of which sanctioned entities would be involved to justify so-called secondary sanctions. They widened that in June, and that has had quite an impact. Just the mere threat of that. You do see trade volumes. Russian imports from China going down. And in the past month or so, you've seen a shortage of Chinese yuan in Russia, and borrowing rates for Chinese yuan in Russia shoot up. Their payment delays. So I think that it has been very effective. I think they could go even further and sanction a Chinese bank to really scare them away from doing that business. I think that's one way they could use sanctions to drive a wedge between China and Russia. Because let's face it, if you're a Chinese bank, do you really want to get cut off from the US dollar for the sake of this tiny little business? It's actually, in the greater scheme of things, it's not that much. Russia's not that big of an economy. So I think they could be more aggressive, but I think there is concern not to anger or worsen relations with Beijing any more than they already are. And I think that's short-sighted, actually.
I mean, secondary sanctions have been used in very few cases, and one of the few cases was against the Chinese bank, I think, Kunlun Bank, but it was a small bank, and I think, this is in the Iran case, and so perhaps it was a disposable bank. But if what I find quite interesting is that we don't really see Western governments promoting the positive effect or the impact that sanctions are having. I mean, again, in your reporting, I'm sure you're regularly shown examples of gaps in the military supply chain in Russia, or tanks that are kind of rolling out without night vision equipment and so on. So do you feel there's a kind of a body of evidence out there that Western governments aren't talking about because it's classified, or do you think we just have to wait and see the sanctions slowly decay the Russian economy?
No, you're right. I don't think they've explained the impact clearly enough. There was a report by the U.S. Treasury at the end of last year trying to quantify it, and I think that was one attempt to do so, looking at the cost to the Russian economy, particularly on oil. But they could do a much better job of showing the damage to Russia's defense industry in particular. I mean, the fact that Russia has to turn to Iran and North Korea for missiles shows they can't do it all on their own, and it is having an impact. But I think it's hard to sell. This is complicated stuff. Whether or not showing a tank without night vision gear is going to do it, I'm not sure.
Well, I think they should at least try. So let's talk about a couple of countries. I mean, you've mentioned China. In a way, that's the most difficult case. But there are a couple of countries that you talk about in the book. The first one is in the EU, Cyprus. I think you call it the Trojan horse. Why do you call it the Trojan horse?
Well, various people called it that, that I spoke to in Cyprus. So the Cyprus chapter was really kind of a look back, because Russia had used Cyprus as a venue for offshoring assets for so many years. So when the full-scale invasion happened, there was huge pressure on Cypriot officials to crack down on Russian money there. And I think they didn't move fast enough. And the sense I got while I was there, I couldn't prove it, but that a lot of money had been spirited away. And officially, Cyprus, the amount that they had frozen was minuscule compared to the size of the Russian assets we believed to be in Cyprus. But, and there were various lawyers there. I have to recount this yacht I was on with some lawyers talking about how to get around the sanctions, and they all kept saying, well, you can set up in Dubai, you can set up in the UAE, so...
I should just take a time out there, because that's the bit of the book actually I enjoyed the most, is where you managed to I don't know, you just got yourself invited onto a yacht which was basically floating around off the shore in Cyprus, and it was essentially a drinks party on how to circumvent sanctions.
Yes.
You just got invited to that.
I just signed up. I said I was a writer. I gave my name. They didn't ask any questions, so... that was when I was like, oh my God, I have to start the book now. I have to get on a plane to Cyprus right away, because this is just too good to be true when I found out it was happening. So, yeah, I mean, there's clearly the enabler community in Cyprus is still operating strong, even if perhaps the number of Russians there has been, has reduced dramatically. But it's still a venue, and there's still a way for Russian money to get through there, much harder now.
In looking at Cyprus, did you get a sense of the extent to which, because the US and the UK have sanctioned lawyers in Cyprus, correct, right? So you've had to kind of reach into Cyprus to help them sort themselves out. Did you get a sense of the impact that had had?
Yeah, because they sanctioned one guy who was a notorious, shall I say, was a very, very important lawyer and accountant to a lot of these guys for many, many years, and putting him on the sanctions list and blocking his assets was a shock. Now, when I was there, they said, "What took you so long?" Everyone knew what he was doing, but it was. I think it did have a huge impact because he worked for so many important Russian billionaires, but there are plenty of other lawyers and accountants operating in Cyprus that could spring up to take his place. It's become harder, no doubt. And Cyprus, I mean, it should give credit where credit is due. They have done quite a bit, but I think more could be done.
We've got some catching up to do, that's for sure. And then the other country that you write about is the famous three-letter acronym in the Middle East, the UAE. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the UAE has kind of responded to threats of US sanctions, and what sort of game is the UAE playing, and also perhaps just the word on it as a center for kind of cryptocurrency activity and also, of course, gold.
Right. So anecdotal reporting made me realize that all the money had been flowing to Dubai, particularly in the first year after the invasion, when there were very few checks, and UAE was really just an open door to Russian money. In fairness, some of it were Russians trying to avoid the mobilization order, sort of ordinary Russians, but a lot of very wealthy Russians set up there, used it as a base. There was a ton of money going into property, into mansions and villas, with very little questions asked. If you recall, the FATF had put the UAE on its gray list, and over the following year, it had worked very hard to try to get off the gray list and try to impose additional regulations, particularly on real estate agents, to check the sources of money, to report transactions in cash or in crypto. But I think it did become harder for Russians to open banks in the UAE. That was what I was told by a few Russians. But I know that there were sanctioned Russians using all sorts of other means to operate out of Dubai, either through cryptocurrencies that came up repeatedly, albeit it was anecdotal, but several people were saying, oh, you just can send money through Tether, USDT, because it's pegged to the US dollar, so it's relatively safe. I mean, I don't think you want to be sending hundreds of millions of dollars at once, but you could certainly buy a nice Dubai villa with some Tether coins. Now, the UAE did manage to get off the FATF gray list, surprisingly. And it did move to revoke a license against, for MTS, this Russian bank operating in the UAE under heavy pressure from US officials. So it did take some steps, but from my reporting, UAE as a cryptocurrency hub is still going strong. And so I don't think they've cleaned up the crypto business in a way that they need to, and I would expect more action on that front, either from the US Justice Department or even from the UAE.
We haven't talked much about mega yachts, but I think you pointed to the Madame Goo and one or two others that found their way to the UAE and a nice safe haven. I wanted just to go back to China for a moment in response to a question that's been asked, because you talked about, could a secondary sanction against a Chinese bank be used to kind of drive a wedge between China and Russia? How important do we think China is to Russia in this situation, bearing in mind that it's sort of buying ammunition from North Korea and it's buying missiles from Iran? I mean, if China were to freeze its relationship with Russia, is that going to be a game changer?
I think it could be, yeah, because they are very dependent on both exports of oil to China and increasingly LNG, which they're trying to do in limited capacity, but also just the flow of semiconductors and components and machine tools that they need to maintain their defense industry. I don't think that Putin can continue to produce missiles at the rate he wants to without China's help. And I think China has been a key enabler for that. And I don't think there's an endless supply of North Korean missiles that are as effective as what Russia's able to produce. I mean, I was in Ukraine in June. It's just the constant, many of you people probably know this, but Russia's strategy is to just hit Ukraine with a barrage of missiles all at once to overwhelm their missile defense systems, the Patriots, what have you. So there'll be a pause where Russia will build up its stock and then just hit Ukraine in one go and hope that if you get through. So that strategy could be unsustainable if it's really cut off from the components it needs, because it isn't able, Russia's defense, it hasn't been able to produce the kind of chips it needs. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary the extent to which you look into these Russian missiles and how much Western tech is in there, and how many Western machines have been used to make some of these components.
So just on that, I mean, obviously the US authorities in particular have been, over the years, punishing Western banks for facilitating sanctions, circumvention, and so on. But when are we going to see a kind of an HSBC or a BNP Paribas moment for the tech industry here? Because surely, if we've learned anything, it is that words don't lead to actions when it comes to learning lessons on sanctions. It's the fines, it's the penalties, it's the kind of public shaming.
Very good question, and one that I have been somewhat obsessed with for a few months. I've been working on a story related to that since I finished the book. But I think you're right. There has to be some accountability put on these Western companies that are supplying the semiconductors, that they can't just say, we've sold it on through our authorized distributors, we've done all the checks there, and whatever happens later is not our problem. There was one time when banks said that about money laundering, right? And they were forced to step up and really vet and invest in compliance. So I do think that they need to be able to hold one of these big semiconductor companies accountable. Now, what they say is, well, we can't bring any action without evidence that they knowingly and willfully violated the export controls. So that means some kind of email traffic showing that they knew where this stuff was going, or there should be some kind of change in legislation to change the requirements, the sort of know your customer rules in the same way that the banks have been forced to follow. So I do think there is probably, I did speak to people in the Justice Department who are a bit frustrated that they haven't been able to bring any kind of charges. I think there's a lot of political pressure not to do so. I think there have been a lot of subpoenas sent out looking for evidence, but nothing has come to the fore yet. And I do think there is a degree of political pressure on the Commerce Department not to push forward on it, but they are also woefully under-resourced for the Cold War battle they're now expected to fight.
And the result is that the banks get asked to know what their corporate clients are doing, and you have this foreign financial institution risk that you referred to.
Right, so they're trying to enforce the export controls not through the tech companies, but through the banks.
Yeah. We touched at the very beginning on the question of the Russian central bank assets, and there are some questions about that on the Slido. How have we made this so complicated?
It's so depressing, actually. It did look like, well, for one, let's just be clear. The U.S., after sort of dithering on this for over a year and a half, finally agreed to go ahead with seizing the principal, the Russia's central bank assets, instead of just using the interest on them, that they would go ahead and seize the principal. The problem is the U.S. doesn't have that much in Russia's central bank. Russia moved a lot of its assets away from dollars because they were worried that the U.S. would do just this very thing. So there was legislation passed in Congress authorizing the president to seize those assets. So the U.S. is ready to go, Canada is ready to go, UK has been supportive, but most of the money happens to be in Europe, and Europe remains divided. So in walks Dalip Singh, who is Biden's Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics. He had been with the Biden administration in the first couple of months of the war, left for personal reasons, and came back at the end of February 2024. He comes up with this financial engineering solution to raise a $50 billion loan for Ukraine, backed by the interest payments on these Russian assets. That's agreed by the G7, but what the U.S. wants is long-term guarantees that that money will remain frozen. Now, in the EU, they roll over sanctions every 6 months, and Viktor Orban of Hungary has gotten in the way and prevented the EU from providing those long-term assurances to the US that the money will remain frozen. So Ursula von der Leyen comes up with a fix to raise a 35 billion euro loan backed by those Russian central bank, the interest payments on those Russian central bank reserves in Europe. That because it's in the EU, it doesn't need to be frozen for the long term, but it's still unclear if even 35 billion is going to get through at this point. And the US, I don't know where the US is, because they won't be able to raise much without those guarantees that that money will be frozen long term. And of course, we have a US election coming up that could change absolutely everything.
Great outlook, thank you. So I was going to ask two final questions. The first one is that we've heard repeatedly from Western leaders that we're, variations of we're dealing powerful blows against the Russian economy is being decimated. Take your pick of the hyperbole. Are we? And if we're not, what do we need to do in order to genuinely demonstrate to the Ukrainians that we are going to use sanctions to help them win the war?
Right. So I think the pressure from sanctions is building, and you see that in the Russian economy. Inflation is 9%, interest rates are 19%. This is the Russian central banker trying to cool the economy that Putin has been heating up with his record spending on defense. Bloomberg's own calculation is that the Russian economy will slow to 1.2% next year, which is virtually flat in real terms. So this is why Putin is running out of time. I do think it is unsustainable. He's facing massive labor shortages, both for the defense factories as well as for recruiting for his meat grinder in Ukraine. He's had to shower even bigger bonuses on Russians to persuade them to sign up to fight. And it looks like he's got to recruit another 500,000 soldiers in the next year, which is just incredible, given the other constraints on the Russian economy. So I do think he is running out of time. Now, I think the oil is the key, and I think if they can figure out a way to go after Russian oil revenues more effectively, that could have a real impact, because if you go back to the 1980s, it's always been about the oil. It undermined the Soviet economy in the mid to late 80s. It was one of the factors behind Yeltsin's difficulties transitioning the Russian economy back then, because the oil price was relatively low. Putin has enjoyed an incredibly high, relatively speaking, high price for oil. Now, oil prices are coming down now, so there is room for more aggressive enforcement action. I think there had been a hesitation to go after some of Russia's shadow fleet, because they don't want to do anything that would cause energy prices to go up. But if the economy in China is softening, so demand in China is softening, oil prices are coming down, the Russian oil is trading, it goes up and down every day, but roughly around the price cap now, at least from the Baltic. What they could do is lower the price cap and really properly enforce it, and blacklist more of these tankers, particularly some of the core vessels that operate as part of the shadow fleet. And I think they may have room to do that now without, worsening inflation. Depending on the outcome of the U.S. election, maybe if Harris wins, she'll feel like she's got room to do that. I think it's very hard to see any really aggressive enforcement action in the run-up to the U.S. election.
Yes, I mean, it's something we watched closely because, of course, it was one of the things that came out of the EPC, the European Parliamentary Community, that was kind of Keir Starmer's first weekend, more or less, as Prime Minister. And so I suppose we're watching to see what happens on the oil price cap, because we can have a big discussion about whether it was a good idea, it's quite smart. I'm sure you and I have spoken to the same people about this. I certainly thought it was a terrible idea, but guess what? It seems to have sort of worked. The question is, how do we enforce it? And it doesn't feel to me as though we've got our arms around that yet. Or are you more positive about the ability to enforce?
Well, just recently, for instance, the U.S. Treasury has started investigating some of these Western the American Club, one of the major insurance providers, for working with a Dubai trader trading Russian oil. So clearly there is scope for them to go after. I mean, we all know the big companies in Dubai that are doing this stuff. So, hopefully that will have some effect. But I do think just going after some of these tankers might have an effect. Now, some of the sanctioned tankers have, they hesitated to call at ports, initially worried, the Indians were worried about accepting a sanctioned vessel. Now, because no action was taken, they're feeling a little bit more emboldened. But if there could be some sort of action to prevent any of those blacklisted vessels from calling at ports, I think that could have an effect. It's an imperfect policy. I mean, I agree with you. It worked for a while. It is having some effect, but I think it could work a lot better because they were supposed to review the cap regularly, and they get in a room in Brussels and they review it and they say, oh yes, it's working. But in reality, it should have been set lower, and the political will required to agree a new number is just difficult to envisage right now.
Well, I should give a shout out. I'm part of the Yermak McFall working group, and there's some great work that's been done by that group on, yes, exactly, arguing why it should be lower and why it wouldn't create some of the risks to energy security that some people suggest. Now, the last question, it doesn't call you out on the title of your book, but on the title of your book, Punishing Putin. And the question is, will Putin ever be punished? And there's another question which we hosted here just a week or so ago, Vladimir Kara-Murza, and he was also talking about that he hoped to see Putin held accountable for his crimes one day. Will we see Putin punished?
That's $1 million question. I don't think he's going to retire. I think we need to, disabuse ourselves of that notion. He's not. That's why he needs to stay in power, because if he goes, I think he doesn't survive. And so maintaining this war is part of his bid to stay in power. I think the economy is now on a war footing. If he stops the war and moves away from, investing in the defense industry, it's going to be very hard to transition the economy away. I don't think he's going to be punished in any Western, in an international court. And I'm somewhat pessimistic that whoever might replace him, however he might go and whenever he might go, would be any better, given the political situation in Russia. I think you would need, at the very least, a transitional figure. And I think Putin has been incredibly effective at selling his message that the West is against us, that we're fighting a war against NATO. And even Russians that were very against the war in the beginning are now telling me that they think they don't like it, but they don't want Russia to lose. And that is a very dangerous, I think, and widespread belief. So I think we're in this for the long haul.
Which is all the more reason why we should be doing everything we can to accelerate Ukraine's victory via the proper implementation and enforcement of sanctions. Stephanie, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
So thank you all very much for your questions on Slido. I'm sure several people will complain to me that I didn't get to your questions, but I tried my best. There are now drinks in the library. As I said, if you would like to buy the book, it's upstairs. The bookseller has been waiting patiently, and Stephanie would be delighted to sign. And I should also say that if you like our events, if you want to support us, then as some of you have heard me say before, our smallest team member, who is barely 1 foot high, is our little electronic donation box, which is in the library. It's like tapping in to the tube or the bus. If you use public transport, do please think about supporting the work that we do. It would be much appreciated. But again, Stephanie from Bloomberg, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.